Stray Dog Blocks Road in the Rain, a story that will leave you speechless. What happens in the middle completely changes the ending. We'd love to know where you're watching this video from. Leave a comment below and let us know. While you're here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. The rain poured mercilessly over the city, turning the streets into rivers of shimmering reflections beneath the headlights of passing cars. Thunder rolled in the distance, rumbling like an ominous warning to those still outside. Most drivers rushed through the downpour, eager to reach the warmth of their homes, but one man, Ethan Carter, gritted his teeth in frustration as traffic slowed to a crawl. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, tapping the steering wheel impatiently. Ethan was used to late nights at the office, but today was different. Today, he had promised his sister he'd be there for dinner. She had been persistent, almost pleading with him to show up this time. Just as he turned onto a dimly lit side street, his headlights caught something unusual. In the middle of the road, completely drenched and unmoving, stood a stray dog. Its fur clung to its thin frame, and its dark eyes stared straight into Ethan's, unwavering and resolute. "Are you kidding me?" Ethan groaned, leaning on his horn. The sharp sound cut through the night, but the dog didn't flinch. It simply stood its ground, soaked and shivering, yet somehow determined. Ethan cursed under his breath and reached for the gear shift, intending to nudge forward slowly to scare the mud off the road. But then, something made him pause. The dog held something in its mouth, a piece of paper, crumpled and wet from the rain. Curiosity flickered in Ethan's mind, cutting through his irritation. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of it. With a sigh, he pushed open the car door and stepped into the cold rain, shivering as the icy drops soaked through his expensive suit. "All right, buddy, what's your deal?" he muttered, approaching cautiously. The dog didn't back away. Instead, it gazed at him with an intensity that made Ethan feel uneasy. He crouched down and carefully took the wet paper from the dog's jaws. Flattening it out against his palm, his breath hitched. Despite the damage from the rain, he could make out the smiling face of a little girl, her arm wrapped around the very same dog now sitting in front of him. Ethan's eyes widened in shock. He had seen that face before. Posters plastered all over the city, "Missing Lila Anderson, 8 years old." A lump formed in his throat. "No way." The dog barked once, sharp and commanding, snapping him out of his thoughts. It turned and bolted down the street, pausing only to glance back at him, as if urging him to follow. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in his car and drive away. But something inside wouldn't let him. Clenching his jaw, he took off after the dog, his shoes splashing through puddles as he chased it into the night. Ethan sprinted through the rain-slicked streets, his heart pounding in his chest as he followed the relentless dog. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty sidewalks. Each splash of his feet in the puddles sent chills up his spine, but he couldn't stop now. The urgency in the dog's every move told him this was bigger than he could have imagined. The animal moved with a clear sense of purpose, weaving through alleyways and across deserted intersections, never once looking back to see if Ethan was still following. It didn't need to. Ethan was committed now. "Where the hell are you taking me?" he panted, trying to keep up. His expensive dress shoes were soaked, and his once crisp suit clung to him like a second skin, but none of that mattered. Finally, they arrived at the outskirts of town, where the neatly paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt and abandoned buildings. The dog slowed as they neared an old, boarded-up house with peeling paint and shattered windows. Ethan skidded to a halt, panting heavily. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, wiping the rain from his eyes. The house looked like something out of a horror movie, and every rational part of him screamed to turn back. But then he heard it, soft, muffled sobbing coming from inside. His pulse spiked. "Lila," he called out cautiously, stepping closer to the porch. The dog barked and pawed at the door urgently. Ethan swallowed hard and reached for the rusty doorknob. The door creaked open with an ominous groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room and revealing overturned furniture and scattered debris. In the far corner, huddled beneath a torn blanket, was a small figure, Lila. The little girl's wide, tear-streaked eyes locked onto Ethan's, filled with fear and exhaustion. Who are you?" she whispered, clutching the blanket tightly around her. Ethan raised his hands in a calming gesture. "I'm here to help," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "Your dog led me here." At the mention of the dog, Lila's expression softened slightly, and the canine trotted over to her side, nuzzling her reassuringly. Ethan took a cautious step forward, scanning the room. "Are you alone? Where are your parents?" he asked. Lila hesitated before shaking her head. "No, I'm hiding. From him." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "From who, Lila?" Before she could answer, a sudden noise echoed from the back of the house. A heavy footstep, slow and deliberate. Ethan's stomach knotted. Someone else was here. The dog's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. Ethan quickly turned to Lila. "We have to go. Now." She nodded, slipping her tiny hand into his. Just as he turned to leave, the front door slammed shut behind them. Ethan's heart pounded as he spun around, but the shadows in the doorway remained still. Someone didn't want them to leave. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he instinctively pulled Lila closer to him. The dog stood rigid at their side, its low growl vibrating through the tense air. The oppressive silence that followed the slamming door was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder outside. His mind raced. "Think, Ethan, think." He glanced around the room, eyes darting between the broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. There was no way he was letting Lila stay in this place a second longer. Lila's grip on his hand tightened. "He's coming back," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan crouched to her level. "Who, Lila? Who did this to you?" Before she could answer, a slow creak echoed from the hallway. Ethan turned sharply, his pulse hammering in his ears. A shadow stretched across the wall, tall, deliberate, menacing. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew they were out of time. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Lila, stepping in front of her protectively. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he'd figure it out. He had to. The shadow drew closer, and the dim light of the flickering street lamp outside finally revealed the figure. A man, his clothes damp from the rain, his eyes cold and calculating. His face was partially hidden by the shadows, but Ethan could see enough to know he was trouble. "Look what we have here," the man drawled, his lips curling into a smirk. "I was wondering when someone would come looking for the little princess." Lila whimpered, pressing herself against Ethan's leg. "Please don't let him take me," she whispered. Ethan squared his shoulders, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "I don't know who you are, but we're leaving. Now." The man took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. "I don't think so, pal. She's mine." Ethan's jaw clenched. "She's not an object. You're not taking her anywhere." Without warning, the dog lunged, snapping its teeth with a fierce snarl. The man stumbled back, cursing, and Ethan seized the moment. Grabbing Lila's hand, he dashed toward the window, ignoring the shards of glass that rained down as he shattered it with his elbow. "Go," he urged, lifting her through the opening. Lila scrambled out into the rain, followed closely by the dog. Ethan hauled himself through just as the man lunged for him, his fingers grazing Ethan's shirt. They hit the wet pavement hard, Ethan rolling to cushion Lila's fall. He grabbed her again and ran, not daring to look back. The dog sprinted alongside them, barking fiercely as if to ward off their pursuer. As they rounded a corner, Ethan ducked into a narrow alley, pressing Lila against the wall to catch his breath. His heart pounded wildly. "Are you okay?" he asked, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. She nodded, shivering but safe for now. "Ethan," she whispered. "He's not going to stop." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his drenched hair. "We'll figure something out," he promised. But deep down, he knew they were in way over their heads. In the distance, footsteps echoed against the rain-slicked streets. The man was still after them, and Ethan had no idea how far he'd go to get what he wanted. Ethan pressed his back against the damp brick wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The alley was narrow, offering them little space to hide, and the steady sound of footsteps closing in made his skin crawl. Lila clung to him, trembling, while the dog stood in front of them, ears pricked, muscles tense, ready to defend. Ethan knew they had seconds before the man reached them. He scanned the alley, searching for an escape. His eyes landed on a rusted fire escape ladder dangling just a few feet above their heads. Lila, listen to me, he whispered urgently, crouching down to her level. I need you to climb that ladder and stay quiet, okay? I'll be right behind you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. Ethan lifted her up, and she grasped the cold metal, pulling herself up with surprising strength. The dog barked once, too loud, before jumping and scrambling up behind her. Ethan followed, his hands slipping on the wet rungs, just as a shadow loomed at the alley entrance. Where do you think you're going? The man's voice cut through the rain, laced with malice. Ethan ignored him, forcing himself upward until he reached the platform. He helped Lila onto it and pressed his finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Stay down, he whispered, pulling her close behind the railing. The dog crouched beside them, baring its teeth. Ethan dared to peek over the edge. The man stood below, scanning the darkness with narrowed eyes. Come on now, the man called out, his voice deceptively calm. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be. Ethan's mind raced. He had no idea who this guy was or what he wanted with Lila, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let her fall into his hands. The man took a step further into the alley, peering up. You think you can just run away? His lips curled into a sinister grin. She belongs to him, and you're meddling in something you don't understand. Ethan's blood ran cold. Him? Who the hell was he talking about? A sudden crack of thunder masked their movement as Ethan edged toward an adjacent rooftop. The gap between the buildings wasn't large, but it was wide enough to be dangerous, especially in the rain. You trust me, Lila? He asked softly. She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. Good. On 3 we jump. Lila swallowed hard and took his hand. Ethan counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. They leaped together. Ethan felt his stomach drop as they soared through the air. His feet hit the opposite rooftop, slipping slightly, but he held tight to Lila, pulling her to safety. The dog landed gracefully beside them. Panting, Ethan looked back down into the alley. The man stood below, staring up at them with an eerie calm, as if he expected this. This isn't over, the man called out, his voice carrying through the rain. You can't run forever. Ethan didn't stick around to find out what he meant. He scooped Lila into his arms and ran across the rooftop, the dog's paws clicking beside him. They needed to get somewhere safe. Fast. Later that night, Ethan found an old motel on the outskirts of town, paying in cash to avoid leaving a trail. The tiny room smelled of mildew, but it was shelter. He locked the door, bolted the windows, and finally let himself breathe. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, hugging the dog. Ethan knelt in front of her, wiping the rain from her face with a towel. Who was that man, Lila? He asked gently. She hesitated, eyes darting to the dog for reassurance. He works for my father, she whispered. Ethan frowned. Your father? But the posters say you were kidnapped. Lila's lip quivered. I ran away. Ethan's mind reeled. The whole city was searching for a missing child. But if what she said was true, she wasn't exactly missing. She was escaping. He exhaled, raking a hand through his wet hair. Lila, why did you run? Tears welled in her eyes. Because my father is a very bad man. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. Whatever he had gotten himself into tonight, it was far from over. Ethan sat on the worn motel chair, staring at Lila as she curled up on the bed. The dog nestled protectively beside her. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. My father is a very bad man. He glanced at the crumpled missing person flyer he had grabbed earlier. It painted her father, Richard Calloway, as a grieving man desperate to find his daughter. But if Lila was telling the truth, things were far from what they seemed. He leaned forward. Lila, can you tell me more about him? About why you ran away? The girl hesitated, clutching the dog's fur tightly. He has a lot of money, a lot of power. He pretends to be nice, but when we're alone, he's different. Her voice wavered. He hurt my mom, and when she left, he said I belonged to him now. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Your mom left? Lila nodded. I think she's scared of him too. I heard them fighting one night. She told him he would never change, that one day the truth would come out. But then she was just gone. Ethan's mind raced. He'd heard stories like this before, powerful men who used their influence to hide dark secrets. And now, it seemed, he was caught in the middle of one. A sudden knock on the door made both Ethan and Lila freeze. Who is it? Ethan called, his voice steady but his heart pounding. A deep voice answered from outside. Motel security. Just checking in. Ethan exchanged a look with Lila. Something didn't feel right. He crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. A tall man in a security uniform stood by the door, his face partially obscured by the shadows. But Ethan's gut told him this wasn't just a routine check. He turned back to Lila. Stay here. Keep quiet. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door just enough to see the man's face. Evening, sir, the man said, flashing a forced smile. We've had reports of disturbances. Mind if I take a look around? Ethan forced a casual expression. No disturbances here, just trying to get some rest. The man's eyes scanned the room behind Ethan, lingering a little too long. You traveling alone? Ethan's grip on the doorknob tightened. Yeah, just me. A tense moment passed before the man gave a slow nod. All right. Sorry to bother you. He stepped back, but something about the way he left made Ethan's skin crawl. He shut the door and turned the lock. We have to leave. Now. Lila looked up, frightened. But where will we go? Ethan stuffed his wet jacket into a duffel bag and reached for the car keys. Somewhere they won't find us. The dog barked softly, as if in agreement. Hours later, Ethan drove through the dark countryside, rain still pattering against the windshield. Lila was asleep in the back seat, the dog curled up beside her. Ethan's mind was spinning. He needed answers. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Detective Morales, a gruff voice answered. Yeah, Morales, it's Ethan Walker. A pause. Then, Ethan? Damn, haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on? I need your help. I think I've stumbled into something big. Big how? Morales asked, suspicious. Ethan took a deep breath. Richard Calloway's daughter. She's with me. And she's scared to death of him. Silence. Then a low whistle. You're in deep, man. Calloway's got half the police force in his pocket. I need to get her somewhere safe. Morales sighed. Meet me at the old gas station on Route 9 in an hour. And Ethan? Be careful. Calloway doesn't play fair. Ethan hung up and glanced at Lila in the rearview mirror. If Morales was right, they were already in more danger than he'd thought. Ethan pulled into the dimly lit gas station on Route 9, the neon sign flickering erratically in the rain. The place looked abandoned, with only a single flickering light inside the convenience store casting eerie shadows. He checked the rearview mirror. Lila was still asleep, her small figure curled under a thin blanket, the dog's head resting protectively on her lap. He sighed and stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't like depending on old contacts, but Morales was the only cop he trusted, or at least used to trust. A black sedan rolled up slowly, its headlights cutting through the rain. Ethan tensed as the driver's door opened and Detective Morales stepped out, wearing a worn leather jacket and an expression that had seen too much over the years. Ethan, Morales greeted, eyeing him warily. You look like hell. Yeah, well, I've been through it, Ethan replied. Thanks for coming. Morales leaned against his car, lighting a cigarette. Tell me everything. Ethan glanced back at his car, lowering his voice. Lila says her dad's dangerous, that he's hurt people. I need to know what we're dealing with here. Morales exhaled a long stream of smoke. Calloway's got his hands in a lot of dirty deals. Real estate scams, bribery, maybe worse. But no one's got enough on him to bring him down. People who try tend to disappear. Ethan's stomach churned. And what about his wife? Morales' eyes darkened. Rumors say she didn't just leave. She vanished. No paper trail, no goodbye. Just gone. Ethan's jaw clenched. Lila had been telling the truth. Morales flicked his cigarette onto the wet pavement. Look, Ethan, if Calloway knows you've got his kid, you're a dead man walking. And that little girl? She's in more danger than you realize. Ethan nodded. I need to get her out of town. Somewhere safe. Morales glanced around before lowering his voice. I know someone. Works with a network that helps people disappear. It's risky, but it might be your best shot. Ethan hesitated. Disappearing meant losing everything, cutting all ties. Was he ready for that? Before he could answer, Lila's voice came from behind. I don't want to disappear. Both men turned. She stood by the car, her arms wrapped around herself, rain dripping from her hair. I want to find my mom, she said, her eyes pleading. If she's alive, I need to know. Ethan exchanged a look with Morales. Can you help us find her? Morales sighed. I can try, but we'll need to be careful. Calloway's got eyes everywhere. Suddenly, a car sped past the gas station, its tires screeching on the wet asphalt. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as the sedan slowed, just enough for the driver to get a look at them before disappearing down the road. That's one of Calloway's guys, Morales muttered. We've got to move. Now. Ethan rushed to the car, Lila and the dog hopping in without hesitation. Morales handed him a burner phone. I'll call you when I have something on her mother. Until then, stay off the grid. Ethan nodded, starting the engine. As they pulled out onto the road, Lila whispered, Thank you. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. We're not done yet, kid. As the dark highway stretched ahead, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about getting away anymore. It was about finding the truth, no matter how dangerous it would be. The highway stretched endlessly under the darkened sky, raindrops pounding against the windshield like a relentless drumbeat. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. In the back seat, Lila clutched the damp photograph of her mother, her fingers tracing the faded edges as if they held answers. The German shepherd, ever watchful, rested his head on her lap, his eyes darting to the window at every passing shadow. Ethan's mind raced. Morales' words echoed in his head. Calloway's got eyes everywhere. He knew they couldn't stay on the main roads for long. He needed a plan, and fast. We can't keep running like this, Ethan said, breaking the heavy silence. We need somewhere safe to figure out our next move. Lila's voice was small but determined. My mom. She used to talk about a place. A cabin. In the woods, by a lake. She said it was where she felt safe. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Do you remember where? She nodded hesitantly. It's near a place called Hollow Creek. I remember the name because she always said it was our secret hideaway. Ethan's chest tightened. Hollow Creek was a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from prying eyes. It could be their best bet, or a trap waiting to spring. But right now, they didn't have many options. All right, kid, he said, making a sharp turn onto a narrow back road. Let's go find your secret hideaway. Hours passed in tense silence as they drove deeper into the woods. Towering pines loomed over them, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the eerie fog clung to the ground like a ghostly veil. Lila sat up straighter, eyes wide with recognition. It's close, she whispered. I think it's just past that old sign. Ethan squinted through the fog and spotted a weathered wooden sign barely hanging onto its post. Hollow Creek, private property. He pulled the car onto a narrow dirt path, the tires crunching over fallen leaves. The deeper they went, the more overgrown the trail became, until finally, the faint outline of a cabin emerged through the trees. It was small, weathered, and forgotten by time. But Lila's face lit up with familiarity. This is it, she breathed, opening the door before Ethan could say anything. The dog jumped out after her, tail wagging as if he, too, remembered the place. Ethan followed cautiously, hand resting on the gun hidden in his jacket. Stay close, kid. We don't know who's been here. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old memories. Dust coated every surface, but remnants of a life once lived remained. family photos, a pair of worn slippers by the fireplace, and an overturned coffee cup on the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. Lila's eyes scanned the room, her hands trembling. "She was here," she whispered. Ethan exhaled, relieved to see no signs of recent intrusion. "We'll stay here for now," he said. "I'll check the perimeter." As he stepped outside, the woods pressed in around him, every creak of the trees putting him on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, a sharp bark echoed through the trees. Ethan spun around just in time to see the German shepherd bolt toward the edge of the forest, barking furiously at something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. "Lila, stay inside," Ethan yelled, pulling his gun and moving toward the tree-line. A figure darted between the trees, disappearing into the darkness before Ethan could get a good look. He cursed under his breath and knelt beside the dog, who was growling low, eyes locked on the woods. "We're not alone," Ethan muttered, his pulse hammering in his ears. Returning to the cabin, he locked the door behind him. Lila looked up, eyes wide with fear. "Is someone out there?" Ethan forced a calm expression. "Just a deer," he lied. "But we need to be careful." Lila nodded, but Ethan knew the truth. Someone had found them, and it was only a matter of time before Calloway made his move. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unease. Ethan paced near the window, occasionally pulling back the curtain to peer into the dark forest. Lila sat on the couch, clutching the photo of her mother while the German shepherd lay at her feet, ears perked, alert to every sound. Ethan's thoughts churned. If Calloway's men had found them, they needed to move fast, but they couldn't keep running blind. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Lila," he said gently, sitting across from her, "you said your mom talked about this place. Did she ever mention anyone who might know more? Someone she trusted?" Lila bit her lip, thinking. "Maybe there was a man. Mr. Dawson. He was like an uncle to me. He used to visit us sometimes, and my mom always said he was the only person she could trust." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Where can we find him?" Lila hesitated. "I don't know. Mom just said he lived where the mountains kissed the sky. I never understood what that meant." Ethan cursed under his breath. It wasn't much to go on, but he'd heard that phrase before. It was a local saying for an old mountain town called Summit Ridge, about 50 miles west. "All right," he said, standing up. "We'll head there at first light." Before Lila could respond, the dog suddenly jumped to his feet, ears pinned back. A low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. Ethan's grip tightened around his gun. A faint creak echoed outside the cabin. Someone, or something, was out there. Ethan motioned for Lila to stay quiet as he crept toward the door. He carefully unbolted it and swung it open, gun raised. Silence. Then, a voice sliced through the darkness. "You've been making it real hard to find you, Ethan." Ethan's heart sank. He recognized the voice instantly, Danny Calloway. A shadowy figure stepped forward, flanked by 2 other men. Calloway's smirk was smug, his eyes cold and calculating. "Hand over the girl, and maybe I'll let you walk away." Ethan steadied his aim. "Not gonna happen, Calloway." Calloway sighed, feigning disappointment. "You always did make things difficult. Guess I'll have to take her myself." Before Ethan could react, a shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the night. "Lila, run!" Ethan shouted, returning fire as he dove for cover. The dog barked furiously, standing protectively in front of the terrified girl as they scrambled toward the back of the cabin. Ethan's mind raced. They were trapped. But then he noticed something. The trapdoor near the fireplace, partially hidden under a rug. "Lila, get down there," he ordered, shoving the rug aside and pulling it open. She hesitated, eyes wide with fear, but Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. "Go. I'll find you." The girl and the dog disappeared into the dark crawl space just as Calloway's men kicked down the front door. Ethan turned, gritting his teeth. It was time to settle this. Meanwhile, beneath the cabin, Lila crawled through the narrow tunnel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dog followed closely behind, nudging her forward whenever she slowed. The passage smelled of earth and damp wood, but it was their only hope. After what felt like an eternity, she emerged into the cold night air, gasping as she looked around. They were behind the cabin now, hidden among the thick trees. She could hear the gunfire still ringing inside, but she had to keep moving. Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Fear gripped her, but before she could react, an older man stepped out of the vehicle, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "Lila," he called softly. She froze. "Who are you?" The man took a step closer, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in a long time, kindness. "I'm Dawson. Your mother sent me." Tears welled in her eyes. "You knew my mom?" Dawson nodded solemnly. "And I know the truth, but we need to get out of here. Now." With one last glance toward the cabin, Lila climbed into the truck, the dog jumping in beside her. As Dawson sped away, she whispered, "Please, don't let anything happen to Ethan." Ethan crouched behind the overturned table, his breathing ragged as Calloway's men closed in. The old wooden cabin groaned under the strain of the storm outside, lightning illuminating the dark figures moving through the doorway. "Come on, Ethan," Calloway's voice echoed through the cabin. "We both know how this ends. Just hand over the girl, and I'll let you walk away in one piece." Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping his gun tightly. "Yeah? Last time you said that, I ended up with a bullet in my shoulder." Calloway chuckled darkly. "You should have stayed out of this." Ethan peeked around the corner, assessing his options. The men were blocking the exits, but the narrow hallway leading to the back of the cabin might still be clear. If he could make it out and circle back through the woods, he could buy time to get to Lila. He took a deep breath and made his move, sprinting toward the hallway. A burst of gunfire erupted behind him, splintering the wooden walls as he dove through the back door and into the rain-soaked forest. Branches whipped against his face as he pushed forward, adrenaline fueling his steps. He needed to reach the highway, needed to find Lila and make sure she was safe. But the pounding footsteps behind him told him Calloway wasn't far behind. Through the downpour, Ethan spotted tire tracks in the mud leading away from the cabin. Dawson. Relief flooded him. Lila was out of danger. But his own escape was far from guaranteed. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, and pain seared through his leg. Ethan stumbled, falling to the ground with a groan. Before he could crawl forward, Calloway's boot pressed down hard on his back, pinning him against the mud. "You just don't know when to quit," Calloway sneered, pressing the barrel of his gun against Ethan's temple. "Where's the girl?" Ethan clenched his jaw, glaring up at him. "Go to hell." Calloway's smirk faltered, but before he could pull the trigger, a deep growl cut through the night. The German shepherd appeared from the shadows, teeth bared and eyes locked onto Calloway. "Get lost, mutt," Calloway muttered, kicking dirt at the dog. But the shepherd didn't back down. Instead, it lunged forward, sinking its teeth into Calloway's arm with a ferocity Ethan had never seen before. Calloway screamed, dropping his gun as he struggled to free himself from the dog's grip. Ethan seized the opportunity, grabbing the fallen weapon and pulling himself up. Without hesitation, he aimed and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and Calloway collapsed to the ground, groaning in pain. Breathing heavily, Ethan turned to the dog, who stood protectively by his side. "Good boy," he whispered, patting its soaked fur. With Calloway incapacitated, Ethan limped through the trees until he spotted a pair of headlights approaching from the road. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and Dawson jumped out, his face etched with concern. "Come on, get in," Dawson shouted, pulling Ethan into the truck. Lila, in the back seat, gasped when she saw him, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay," she sobbed, hugging him tightly. Ethan winced but smiled. "Told you I'd find you." Dawson floored the gas pedal, leaving Calloway and his men behind as they disappeared into the rainy night. Hours later, at Dawson's cabin, Ethan sat on the couch, his leg bandaged and a cup of coffee in his hands. Lila curled up beside the dog, who lay at her feet like a silent guardian. Dawson stood by the window, his expression grim. "Your mom was onto something big, Lila." And Calloway was desperate to cover it up. Lila's eyes filled with sadness. "She told me to find you if anything happened. She said you knew the truth." Dawson nodded slowly, turning toward them. I do. And it's time you both knew too. As he began to reveal the truth about Lila's mother and the dangerous secrets she uncovered. Ethan knew their fight wasn't over yet. But for now, they were safe and together. And that, for tonight, was enough. Ethan watched as Dawson paced the room, his expression dark and thoughtful. Lila clung to the German shepherd, who remained alert, his eyes tracking every movement. The cabin was filled with the sound of rain pelting against the roof, adding to the heavy tension in the air. Your mother, Dawson began, rubbing his hands together, was investigating a human trafficking ring operating right here in the city. Ethan stiffened. Human trafficking? You're saying Calloway was involved in something that big? Dawson nodded grimly. Bigger than you think. He wasn't just involved. He was one of the masterminds. Your mom found evidence linking him to dozens of missing children. Lila, you were next on their list. Lila's eyes widened in horror. What? But why? Dawson sighed. Your mother had something they wanted. Evidence. When she refused to back down, they came after her. And when they couldn't get to her, they came after you. Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she grasped the full weight of her mother's warnings and the danger she had been in. I didn't know. I thought she was just being overprotective. Ethan clenched his fists. So that's why Calloway wanted her out of the way. He needed her silenced. Dawson nodded. Exactly. She left the evidence hidden somewhere, and I believe she left clues for Lila to find it. Lila wiped her tears, her face hardening with resolve. Then we have to find it. We have to stop them. Ethan glanced at her, impressed by the courage in her young eyes. You're right. But Calloway's not going to stop coming after you. Dawson stepped forward, pulling a small flash drive from his pocket. I think I know where she hid it. She used to talk about a place where she felt safe, a cabin near Clearwater Lake. It's remote but familiar to her. Ethan nodded. Then that's where we go. Hours later, Clearwater Lake. The road leading to the lake was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick pine trees that cast eerie shadows under the moonlight. Ethan drove cautiously, his eyes scanning the road ahead for any signs of danger. Lila sat in the back seat, clutching the dog tightly. Do you think my mom's still alive? She whispered. Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror, hesitating before answering. I don't know, kid. But we're going to find out. Dawson pointed ahead. There. That's the cabin. The cabin stood in the clearing, old and weathered but sturdy. Ethan killed the engine and grabbed his gun. Stay close. Inside, dust coated every surface, but Dawson moved with purpose, searching through the cabinets and floorboards. Minutes stretched into hours until finally, got it. Dawson held up a small tin box, inside of which was another flash drive wrapped in a piece of cloth. Ethan exhaled in relief. Let's get out of here before. A sudden noise outside cut him off. Headlights beamed through the cracks of the cabin, followed by the sound of tires skidding to a halt. They found us, Ethan muttered, positioning himself by the window. Calloway's men poured out of the vehicles, their silhouettes dark against the headlights. We're surrounded, Dawson whispered. The dog growled low, sensing the imminent danger. Ethan gripped his gun tighter. Looks like we're making a stand.